Welcome to the Pushkin House and to the Pushkin Club and to the Rights in Russia, because this is a joint event of the Pushkin Club and the NGO called Rights in Russia. And tonight's event will be chaired by John Crawford, a researcher and translator of many important things, including the work of Anna Polikovskaya, her first book translated into English, Dirty War, and also the creator of the website devoted to Yury Dmitriev. But before we start with the main theme of our event, I would like us to remember the wonderful person and founder of Memorial, Arseny Borisovich Raginsky, who died yesterday morning after cancer, which lasted for about a year. So I would like us now to have a moment of silence in his honor. Thank you. John, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is, I hope, will be an unusual event because what we're discussing is an unusual history. To begin with, this is a trial in Pietrozavodsk. I don't know if anyone here has visited Pietrozavodsk, but it's not a place that diplomats or journalists have paid much attention to, and it is rather extraordinary that it has become such a cause célèbre, such a matter of wide interest in Russia and outside Russia, when it seemed to be a very, very localized trial, which people expected to be over quickly, concerning someone about whom relatively little was known, if anything. I myself knew nothing about Yury Dmitriev until I was contacted by Simon Pirani, who's here tonight, who first signaled that there was something very odd going on in this case, which most people would agree was he was framed on trumped-up charges, and trying to understand what was going on. What I'd like to do this evening is for the panel of three here to answer your questions. We shall each say something, and I shall maybe try to steer some of the discussion, but really it's an opportunity for everyone here to find out more about this case and about Yury Dmitriev. And my involvement here is, as Marsha said, is that I set up the website, which you can find. It's very simple. It's Dmitriev Affair, all one word, .com, which has a considerable amount of material on it, a lot in Russian, but a great deal in English as well, so that you can follow what's going on. I also compiled an article on Wikipedia, because there was no mention of him on Wikipedia in English, which was extraordinary, really, considering that some of the discoveries he made are mentioned there, but he was not mentioned. It's peculiar. To my left, Professor Bill Bowring, who is Professor of Law and a practicing barrister, and who knows a great deal about the Russian judicial and legal system, because I think one of the curiosities of this case is what has been happening in court. Why didn't it go according to plan? But also the worry of what will eventually happen, because it's been dragging on now with a couple of sessions each month at most. What on earth is going to happen? How is it going to be resolved? And to my right, Dr. Andrea Gulota, who is perhaps, unless anyone puts up their hand, the only person here who's actually met Yury Dmitriev. I don't know if anyone else has met him here, who has researched particularly on Solovki, the very first Soviet forced labour camp, or concentration camp as it was originally called, and from which the Gulag then expanded over the rest of Karelia and over the rest of the Soviet Union. One thing I thought we would do, though, is that since one person here has met Dmitriev, I don't know how many people here have seen him or heard him, I thought we'd play just a very short news item which appeared on Medusa in early October. I'll explain, it's got Russian subtitles. I'll explain what you're going to see. I think many people here will have some Russian. First of all, you see the corridor of the courtroom in Petrozavodsk, because this trial is being held in closed session. Members of the public and the media are not admitted, because it's a trial that concerns a minor. So the only way we know what's going on inside is from what the defense attorney tells us. So the one way people can go there and show Dmitriev, who you can see here under escort with very strong big men in case he does something dangerous, the only way they can show their appreciation is to stand along that corridor and applaud him, which many of them do twice or more times a day when there are these rare court hearings, as he's brought in and as he's taken out again. There's an interview to begin with Ludmila Ulitskaya, who said in early October what an extraordinary thing it is that at the end of this month President Putin is going to open a monument dedicated to the victims of political repression, which being interpreted, there's a lot of euphemism there, means the people who were arrested, executed, sent to the Gulag during the Soviet regime from 1917 up until the late 1980s. And yet, someone who has done more in his particular region to find out who these people are who were shot, identified them, given people a place to come to remember their relatives. He is on trial in Petrozavodsk at the same moment. So she has a few things to say. And then you see Dmitriev. First of all, you see him on Solovki, where he's expressing his concern about his helpers, saying that, I know it's summer, but I've got on three layers because the gnats here are dreadful, and I'm very worried about the rest of you because they can give you a very nasty bite. And then he's shown at the Day of Remembrance at Sandarmoch on the 5th of August, speaking about the regime and how sooner or later the regime will have to answer. It can frighten us, it can imprison us, it can kill us, but it can't kill everyone, and one day the regime will have to answer for all the things it has done. So that's just a summary of what you'll see if you can play it.
Совершенно потрясающе по своему знаку. В конце этого месяца открывается в Москве памятник. Открывается памятник жертвам политических репрессий. Одновременно с этим в городе Петрозаводске идет процесс против человека, который сделал больше, чем кто бы то ни было для этих самых жертв политических репрессий. Конечно, один из великих людей нашего времени. Этот человек не просто говорит правду, он делает правду. Его поступок, то, что десятки тысяч людей, их места их гибели установлены, могилы были сделаны. Составлена книга памяти этих погибших людей. Она потрясающая. Я сегодня смотрела такую книгу по Красному Буру. И вы знаете, это вот наша когда-тошняя иллюзия давняя, что власть уничтожала там, не знаю, интеллигентов, какие-то национальные проблемы решала таким образом. Вот когда ты держишь этот список, ты понимаешь, что это все. Что в этот список может попасть любой человек просто в соответствии с тем, что сейчас раздавят на 20 тысяч человек, арестовать и уничтожить. Потом будет на 100, и в результате этих разнарядок времени страна потеряла миллионы людей.
Поэтому многие просто не выдерживали и бесплодницы, и вот таких условий содержания, и они просто убирались. Нам, прежде чем мы с вами найдем эти ямки, которые замаскированы там, черничником, в них уже деревья растут, они на поверхности, нам нужно будет почистить кусочек леса. Кусочек леса примерно 200 на 200 метров, это 4 гектара. На мне теплая рубашка. Еще одна рубашка, не потому что я мерзну, а потому что ковры на Секирной горе, они очень, так сказать, хорошо кусаются. И мне просто жалко вас.
Действительно, настали такие времена, когда причистота, помянуть людей, убитых властью, уже некоторая гражданская позиция. И эта гражданская позиция не всегда нравится, ну, скажем так, нашей политической власти. Нельзя бесконечно обманывать свой народ. Да, нас можно обманывать, да, нас можно пугать тюрьмой, нас можно сажать в лагеря, нас можно убивать. Но весь народ эта власть не посадит и не убьет. И в конце концов с этой власти будет спрошено за то, что она сделала. Дорогие мои братцы и сестры, что-то надо с этой властью делать. Самое главное, не бойтесь. Максимум, что она может с вами сделать, это убить.
So, I think that gives you just a feeling of what Dmitriev is like, having collected the material for the website. It's very striking how dignified and how determined he is. He's withstood a period in prison when I think they probably hoped that he would crack at some moment, especially since they'd done one of the nastiest things which the Soviet regime and its successor are so good at doing, which is to take members of the family hostage. But everyone who knows him says there is no sign that he has given way, and he is still standing up to whatever they say to him in court. But Bill, can you give us some account of the system under which he's being tried and what's been happening in court?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So my name's Bill Barry. I've been going to the Soviet Union and Russia since 1983. First of all, I did want to say how sad it is that Arseny Raginsky died yesterday. And actually, there are remarkable, wonderful people in each generation in Russia. And this is the case in Memorial. And I've been working very closely in partnership with them since 1999 on hundreds of cases now at the European Court of Human Rights. And I was a couple of months ago at the Human Rights Centre in Memorial. And there you have 5 young people in their 20s who are the lawyers working on the cases, working in a foreign agent, which is being fined huge amounts of money as a result. I mean, really under difficult circumstances, but you know, it's really extraordinarily heartwarming to see the younger generation coming along as well. and I should say, just by way of credentials, I've been expelled from Russia twice, had my own court case which I won against the FSB and the border guards in 2006, so one can, you know, but I'm not as important as some other people. So, and I'm presently representing the widow of Alexander Litvinenko at European Court of Human Rights, and that's hopefully heading towards some kind of a conclusion. So, I mean, the first question is, hands up please, who has seen the film Leviathan by Zvyagintsev? Well, the people who haven't seen it, you must see it, because it tells you why it was banned in some parts of Russia, because it tells you about the relationship between the church and the state, extremely vividly, but it tells you, I mean, this poor chap whose house is going to be torn down, so I'm spoiling the film for you, to make way for a really horrific church, which you see at the end of the film. And it's his brother, isn't it? The lawyer who comes up from, or anyway, something like that, comes up from Moscow to represent him. And you have an extremely accurate view of what happens in a Russian court, where things are done at machine gun speed in a monotone and very softly, so you can hardly hear what's going on. And actually, that is what one will quite often see. So, as I say, I think that gives you a pretty accurate picture. What kind of a system is it? Well, actually, it's a continental legal system. The way it works is in many ways not dissimilar to France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, other civil law countries. And so you have codes. It's not like in this country where you have a chaotic mixture of precedents and very bizarre patchwork statutes. I mean, you have a criminal code, a criminal procedural code, a civil code, etc. And these were actually developed in the period of the new economic policy, so in the years shortly after the end of the Civil War, when there was a return of state-controlled capitalism in Soviet Russia, and you can't have that if you don't have a legal system. So they got courts again, and they got the codes, and actually the codes kind of persisted through the Soviet period. And what they also had, inherited from the Soviet period, most people don't know this, was an independent bar, founded by Alexander II in 1864, which was the only independent profession in the Soviet time. And there were wonderful advocates who represented the dissidents, and so people like the late Semyon Arya, who was Berezovsky's lawyer in Moscow. They're all Jewish for some reason, but anyway. Yury Schmidt, who died a couple of years ago. Karina Moskalenko, who's still going strong. And all of these people, they represented political crimes, economic crimes during the Soviet period with remarkable results. And, you know, so that is actually little known. And the bar, I'm a barrister, so sorry about this, but the bar in Russia is still absolutely exemplary. And the top criminal firm in Moscow is headed by a Chechen, Murad Musayev, who looks a bit like Jeffrey Robertson, very, very charismatic, in the news quite a lot, and fearlessly defends the people that he defends. So this is the case, I think, with this. So the bar, I think, and it defends itself very well so far. The regime can't like it at all. Nonetheless, there's a tradition there, and as I say, even during the Soviet period. So what about the judges? And actually, just today, there's a publication on Carnegie. So if you, I hope everybody here who, well, it's in English and in Russian, so all you do is subscribe to it for free of charge, put your email in, they will send you notice of the new articles, I think a couple of times a week. And in this morning's roundup, there is a wonderful article by Olga Romanova, whose husband was in prison for quite a long time. She's turned into really outstanding prison reformer and critic of the regime, really writing very powerful stuff. And the article which is in Carnegie this morning is called Judicial Power versus the Judicial System. And it's quite a long article about who are the criminal judges in Russia. Now, huge difference from here. And so the magistrates, as you know, are worthy local people who do it for expenses, and here more than 90% of criminal cases in this country, unqualified, kind of works. I think people are not too dissatisfied with it. Only 1% of cases here go to a jury. People think it's all juries, not at all, no. And professional judges are all former practicing lawyers here. So a young judge is a professional judge is aged 55 minimum. So they've had experience of practice in the courts, and there are only a few thousand of them. Whereas in Russia, like in France or like in Germany, there are 30,000 judges who are career judges, and so you start becoming a judge in principle after law school. However, as Olga Romanova shows in her article, most judges in the district courts hearing criminal cases worked in law enforcement. So number of former practicing lawyers, about nil. The highest proportion is former court secretaries. So you become an administrator, secretary in the court, and then you become a judge, so you've been in the system. But a very high proportion are former prosecutors and former investigators. By the way, detectives, investigators in Russia all have a law degree. Very different from here. So they've been studying law for 5 years before becoming an investigator. And the prosecutors are also quite highly qualified, but they are part of the state law enforcement system. So when one of them then becomes a judge, it is not totally surprising that their outlook is being part of a law enforcement system. So their interest is in, of course, getting a conviction. And they are used to a hierarchy. And so one of the features of the Russian judicial system, and this is what Medvedev, when he was president, called legal nihilism, you know, the prevailing culture, is that they are absolutely subject to the mercy of the court chairman or woman. And there is a dreadful woman who is still the chair of the Moscow City Court, the Court of Appeal, Olga Yegorova, whom I've met, whose husband is a FSB general. And she is absolutely dreadful. And people here might have come across Sergei Anatolievich Pashin, who was sacked twice as a judge from the Moscow City Court because his acquittal rate was too high, i.e. 8%. And the non-jury trial acquittal rate is less than 1%. That's because in Russia, everything depends on the preliminary investigation. And so the preliminary investigation, the defense are excluded from that, and the defense only get to know what's in it when the indictment is prepared. The indictment is not one sheet of paper telling you crisply what the case is, as it would be in England. It's all the evidence that has been collected. So the indictment might well be 200 volumes of material, and the idea being that if there are flaws, and there are sometimes, what will happen is that the case is sent back or stopped before it gets to trial. However, when the case gets to trial, then a conviction is more or less certain, and the defense don't see the indictment until it's sent to the court. So that is one of the real problems. And somebody here might say something in due course. I know John's been talking about his experts before the court, and even though the defense are now have greater freedom to get their own witnesses and experts, actually it's very tough. I speak with some knowledge because I'm one of the fathers of the Ugolovny Processualny Codex, the criminal procedural code, the new one which came into force in 2002, because I was one of the small group of experts working on it with Dmitry Kozak and Yelena Mizulina who's gone mad subsequently, and the deputy head of the FSB, Vladimir Leopoldovich Schulz, who's not a bad chap, etc. So what I'm saying is that once you get into the system, then an acquittal is extremely likely. If you're charged with a really serious offence, then you have a right to jury trial. Jury trial in Russia now extends to the whole country, including Chechnya. In front of a jury, you have about a 20% chance of acquittal, which is not dissimilar to here, actually. So juries are pretty good. The only problem is that if you're acquitted here, it's final, whereas in Russia, it's not final. The prosecution can appeal and generally do. And
not all charges, I think.
Sorry?
Not all crimes.
So they're cutting it back somewhat with
Exactly.
terrorist offences and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, that's what
yeah,
Can I-
all these complications. So I think that's more or less what I'm going to say. But this is the kind of
back
trial.
with a question though.
Yeah.
If Dmitriev has an excellent defence attorney
Yeah.
who has managed to fight off the prosecution, in fact
Yeah.
they've changed the prosecutor,
Yes.
and also the experts who were behind the conviction of Pussy Riot and various political cases, and also the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses declaring that they were an extremist organisation. Those experts have been pushed off the case because he systematically demanded it and proved that
Yeah.
they were not qualified to do it. But how far can he go? And he's carried it on. It's now December. The next court session will be the 26th and 27th of December, when we'll all be thinking about something else. I don't know if that's deliberate, but how much longer can the defence hold this off? Do you think it's automatic that there will be a conviction?
No, that already says something about the judge, doesn't it? Because I think the judge would have brought it to a much quicker end. And there are surprises, see. So, you know, quite a few years ago, I was the observer for Amnesty International in the two trials and an appeal of Alexander Nikitin, who was a nuclear submarine commander who went public about the extreme environmental hazards caused by the Russian nuclear submarines in the Arctic. And he was originally charged with offences that carried capital punishment, with treason and espionage. And there were two trials because the judge of whom nothing was expected, turned out to be excellent. And the first trial, the judge was not in a position to acquit, but sent it back because some of the evidence was just completely outrageous. And the second trial, the judge acquitted. And the case went up to the Supreme Court twice because the prosecution tried to go up a second time on Nadzor, which is supervisory review. And actually the prosecution got a flea in the ear from Vyacheslav Lebedev, who is still there and can give surprises too from time to time. So, you know, it's not totally predictable. And the thing about prosecutors is that it's a very prestigious and well-paid and beautifully dressed profession, you know, when you see them in their bright blue uniforms at trial. But in the Soviet time, and up until 2000, they didn't have to say anything in court. They could rely on the judge to present the case for the state. And even now, they find it really quite difficult to do anything which is not, you know, completely prescribed or what they're used to. And there are some decent ones, but that is a very hierarchical system. So, I mean, I've certainly come across decent ones, and who knows what is going on in this case. So it's possible, you know, that the case might be stopped, sent back, or even that there might be an acquittal. And the fact that it's been allowed to go on so long, I think it's a good sign. If I have 2 seconds for an example, one of the people I work with very closely at Memorial, and Mary knows him very well, is Oleg Petrovich Orlov, who with his wife Tatiana Kasatkina runs the Human Rights Center in Memorial. And Oleg was, after Natasha Estemirova was murdered in Grozny, abducted and murdered, and Oleg Petrovich said, well, it was the climate created by Ramzan Kadyrov which was responsible, so Kadyrov sued, and there was first of all a civil case, and then there was a charge of criminal libel, and actually both of them ended in disaster for Kadyrov, actually. And in both cases the judges were remarkably good, so you do have, they're much better paid than they used to be. They're in much better premises than they used to be. They're much better trained and educated than they used to be. And a few of them would really quite like to be judges and not just state functionaries, you know, so who knows?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you tell us what Dmitriev is charged with, please?
Yes, yes, he's charged with making pornographic images of a minor, and the person in question is his adopted daughter, Natasha. The defence, as soon as they could see some of the evidence, said there's a difference between a naked child and a pornographic image. And they've been repeating this ever since December last year when he was arrested. However, within the the law, which was created in 2012, which I'm afraid is a rather suspicious kind of timing concerning child pornography, there is no definition of pornography. And therefore it's a kind of catch-all. There's a Russian journalist called Maria Eismont, who has for the last 5 or 6 years followed cases where people are accused of pedophilia or child pornography all over the country, and what she's found is very disturbing, that these are cases where the evidence is very often extremely doubtful and unconvincing, but it's a question of getting back at someone. Often it happens between husband and wife. In this case, that was the fear at the beginning, that this is a way of deterring everyone. I mean, people in the West weren't very happy to sign a petition in defence of Dmitriev because they thought, you know, maybe there is something there. But those were the charges brought against him, and these can carry, as someone has pointed out, as much as the sentence for killing someone, for manslaughter. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, this new act which was brought in, and the experts, Bill briefly mentioned, the forensic experts, who should be qualified but who aren't in most cases to give judgments on these issues, are ready, it would seem, to do the bidding of those who commission them to investigate.
No, this is notorious.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Yes,
may I also
yes.
please add that it's quite sort of a common practice to use these judges to smear the names of the human rights defenders, human rights lawyers, and that's quite an established practice, so that the major human rights organizations have prepared the training courses for human rights lawyers and defenders, and they organize these courses to train them how to avoid being subject to these charges by the authorities in Russia, because they're using them left, right and center. So this is a very common practice.
Yep.
And some people really have managed to do it on the preliminary stage of investigation, trying to prove that that was either planted or there's no sufficient evidence and this is all not even going to stand a chance in court. Or in other cases, obviously, they have prepared their cases better. I'm talking about the Secret Services or whoever is there after the human rights defenders who are quite outstanding and they have to be silenced. So I'm afraid there could be, I obviously didn't see the evidence, but I've seen people and I've met people, and you've met these human rights lawyers in Belarus who have been subjected to that. I've interviewed lawyers who have been harassed by that. So this is a proper legal persecution of people who are going against the regime.
Yes, and there was, and quite against any normal judicial procedure, this evidence was shown on television in January. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's sub judice. The trial hadn't begun. It was still, the charges hadn't been finalised because a few more charges were brought against Dmitriev. But in a programme where they said, now what was it? What does Memorial have to hide?
Yeah.
What does Memorial, что скрывает Memorial? They had things about Memorial, which is a foreign agent, and therefore it's in the pay of another state and doing things to undermine Russia, and that's the general theme of that kind of accusation. And then during this program they focused in on Dmitriev because in his case they had evidence. Now what they meant by evidence was they had photographs of his adopted daughter, Natasha, in a naked state because he was keeping, encouraged by the Child Protection Agency, he was keeping a health journal of her since they'd adopted her at the age of 3 and she was emaciated after living in an orphanage. So each year they took a series of photographs to show how she was developing. They stopped, I think, about 3-4 years ago. And these photographs were on his computer. They went nowhere else. They were not posted on the internet, as the programme tried to claim. They were not shown to anyone else. But someone got into their flat when they were out, got onto his computer and took these photographs. Then there was an anonymous denunciation, and then he was arrested and charged. That's the way this is all on the... Sorry, Andrea.
No,
yes.
I just wanted to add, which kind of completes the picture. An important detail is that he was, the moment when they broke into his flat, he was
Yes.
he was called by the police because they found half a gun, not even a whole gun, without bullets or anything else. So they called him in to show why he had half a gun. In fact, this is one of the charges, is that he is illegally possessing a weapon. And while he was there, someone broke into his apartment and accessed the computer and clearly took these files, and this same person then clearly made. So it's clear that there was something built around him. I mean, it's highly coincidental that the moment that he's called by the police, someone breaks into his flat, and that 3 days later, if I'm not wrong, he is an anonymous nurse. So yeah.
So please, any questions on the sort of legal aspect of it, and then we'll... Yes.
You know, just a comment. I mean, it was an odd thing that he did, let's face it. It was a very odd thing for him to document the child's development. And it's understandable why he did it. It's totally understandable. He feared that the child would be taken away from him. There had been incidents where they had accused him of ill treatment. It wasn't actually. But, you know, he was desperate to document this. But actually he wasn't asked to do it. He did it off his own back. And what's very odd, I think, he did it because he spent his life documenting Stalinist grave sites. And he basically applied these forensic methods to the physical development of the child, which is a very peculiar thing to do. So, it's hard because I think it was right to question why he had, you know, a huge number of photographs of the child.
Well, 140.
Yes.
140, of which they chose 9. Several of which were copies of the same photo. So in fact there were 3 poses.
Yes, I just like to point that out, that I think it's right to question why this is going on.
That's why they're using it.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, it's unfortunate that he did it because he gave them this chance.
And there was the other thing though, Heather, was when they began and some information about what they were using against him leaked out, there were also photos of his adopted daughter and his granddaughter running around naked before their bath time. And when his wife was asked, what are these photos, she said they're ordinary family photos. You know, what's pornographic about that? But they didn't subsequently use that. They used only these nine photos. So.
Just on this point, I think my experience with this, John, was that when we first learned about the case and the petition was put on change.org or whatever, I circulated people, particularly historians. I'm a historian of Russia, and I circulated colleagues and asked them to sign the petition, which many of them did. And the petition called for a fair trial and actually didn't seek to comment on the charges. I think that all the things that you've just explained and in the last 10 minutes, it's so important that this information is made more available. I think those of us who interact with Russia realise, in the main, the point that you said, that since the passage of this law, there's been this pattern which has been written about by Maria Eismont, that this law is being used not for the purposes that are written in the law. But I think we've got to bear in mind that as soon as we step outside our immediate people, such as those in this room who are concerned with these sort of issues, you know, the trend in the West is absolutely the opposite, with Weinstein and all the rest, that it's now accepted by society that a lot of things have gone on in workplaces or in families that we now regard as unacceptable, the defence secretary touching somebody's knee, whatever it is, right? And that you know the trend is very much in the other direction. So we can't, and I think we can't. I certainly wouldn't want to dodge this issue or to pretend that it's not an issue. I mean, I agree with you that you know if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, taking that number of photographs is kind of weird. And as a woman colleague said to me when we were discussing the petition, you know, as a mother, I cannot really get my head around that. And I think we have to acknowledge that that's a very, very fair point to make. I think that when you see the whole background, any thinking person can then draw their own conclusions, which is that, and I mean, I thought there was a very powerful article which was reproduced on the Russian Reader, which is a blog, which, by the way, quick commercial, and has been an excellent source of information on this case and many other things, and where it appeared in English, which said, why isn't the famous film director, whose name is now
Nikita Mikhalkov, yes.
Mikhalkov sitting in the next cell along with Dmitriev, because he made a film which kind of won all kinds of prizes showing his own daughter growing up, which includes scenes of her running around naked. So, you know, it's one law for Nikita Mikhalkov and another law for somebody who's doing the work that Dmitriev is doing. But I think I just want to say that we need to campaign, and you know, we need to campaign in such a way that we're saying yes, they've been very clever. We don't know who's stolen his computer. To me, it would just be unbelievable if it was anybody but the forces of darkness. But you know, they're not stupid. They found a way of bringing that information, putting it on television, like they care about the child. But I just think we've got. I think to strengthen our point, we've got to really kind of face that very publicly.
And I think that a follow-on from that, Simon, is that the defence has said all the time, we want new forensic experts, not this Centre for Socio-Cultural Expertise who did the dirty on Pussy Riot and Jehovah's Witnesses and so on. And we want them to look at all 140 photographs, so that any photographs you don't like are seen in the context of what he was doing. And the one other simple point is that he was brought up in an orphanage himself. So he was very keen to save a child from an orphanage of that kind, and they adopted her when she was 3. Yeah.
May I add a little point?
Yeah, sure.
Just sorry, but it actually links well with what you just said. Even having met Dmitriev, I was astonished by the charges, because let's face it, it's a horrible accusation. And I know that many people have had this question mark, and I admit I've had a question mark. However, at a certain point, the daughter of Dmitriev explained a background history, which I think makes this situation, which, as you say, it's rather odd, more explainable. So it seems like he had troubles adopting this girl because he was already old. Then he was given the girl, and at the nursery school at a certain point there was a mess because they found bruises on her body. However, it came out that there weren't bruises, there were ink marks, because I haven't understood exactly this part of the story, but they used like newspaper.
It's like putting mustard plaster.
Yes,
When a child
yes,
has
yes,
an infection, you put
yes.
mustard plaster.
That's
They use
what it was.
newspapers that left stains on the child's body.
Right. I've been an Italian, I don't understand how it works, but however, and after this, with the fear that they might take the girl away from him, he started taking photographs of the girl naked to show that she was, over the time, never having bruises, which makes a little bit more sense if you put this in context. So
there was another question, was that? Yes.
Yeah, but just going to why he was arrested, what would the Russian state have against him? I mean, why is the Russian state scared of a historian who studies of a country which in many ways does not exist anymore?
Yeah. Andrew, can you describe the work that Yury Dmitriev did? Because it butts on the area of you, not quite the same area as yours, but describe what he's spent 25 years doing.
Yeah, well, I'll start from an anecdote of how I met him, because I think it's pretty funny. So I started working on the Solovki prison camp in the history. I'm actually more a literary scholar than a historian. And there were a few people that I lost track of. I didn't know where they ended up, and I suspected they might have been in the Bilamor Canal, in the White Sea-Baltic Canal. And the more I asked around, the more people told me, you have to talk to Dmitriev, you have to talk to Dmitriev. So I was on the Solovki, I actually contacted him, stopped in Petrozavodsk, and the certain point I see this Zhiguli coming from, I was at the railway station square, I see this Zhiguli coming, and like running and stopping all suddenly. He clearly recognized me, I don't know how. And that was him. We went to his place, and I had a list of names that I wanted him to double check, and he offered me a tea, and then I started saying the names, and he opened his archive and his computer, which I suspect is pretty much maybe the same that they took the photograph from. And at a certain point, while I was sitting and he was making his searches on the names that I gave him, I saw a photograph of him in a military suit, and I asked him, Yury Alexeyevich, have you been to war? And he stopped and looked at me and he said, I'm going to show you my war. And he started showing me what he had done. Basically, Dmitriev is the person who had gone in the forests of Karelia to find out the bodies, the common graves where people had been buried and no one knew about. The story, basically, to make it very short, is that in the 80s, when with the perestroika they started to discuss and to be able to speak about properly about what happened during the Soviet times, lots of people started to make researches, and one of the kind of branches of the research was to find out where the people actually had been buried. Dmitriev was already involved in different type of research about the Gulag, specifically finding out the names of the people and compiling the Knigi Pamyati, so the books of remembrance, which are this incredible...
People who were shot. People who were executed.
The people that were shot. So basically they were finding out the names of the people, reconstructing briefly their history, usually the date of birth, the date of conviction, the date when they were killed, and as many biographical data as they could find about these people, and publishing them. And then at a certain point they started to look for the places where actually these people were buried. And Dmitriev had gone already a few times, and there was a period where Karelia actually helped him, and they provided soldiers and other people to help him in his research. And in 1997, he and other two people, Irina Flige, who is the director of Memorial, and Veniamin Yofiev, who used to be the director of Memorial and then died, and is the late husband of Irina Flige, by the way, they actually finally found Sandarmokh. Sandarmokh, which basically they reconstructed. They were looking for the place where the so-called Solovyetsky etap was. So basically, within the Great Terror in 1937, at a certain point, Yezhov sends lists of people and sends around Soviet Union lists of like, you need to shoot 2,000 people, arrest 10,000 people, and so on. And one of such requests arrives to the Solovki prison camp, where there's a lot of prisoners, and Yezhov asked for 1,200 prisoners to be executed. They actually, in the end, execute 1,800 and 1,800, if I'm not wrong. But the first group of prisoners, 1,111, are actually sent to the mainland. They lost trace of them. They know that they're executed. And they found the place, Sandarmokh. Sandarmokh is a place where they found out that these people were executed, but they actually found out that lots of executions were created, were happened there.
60 years after it had happened.
Exactly.
60 years.
So he showed me the photograph of himself digging it and taking out the skulls and taking out, like, literally all the photograph of all these things. That was sort of this incredible archaeology of terror, which is absolutely shocking, what he has done. Why has he become a target? Because he kept on doing this work, even though, I mean, he has found other burial places. And what has happened is that, I think, to make it very simple, Dmitriev is a victim of a memory war. In this moment, there's a clear memory war in Russia between what really happened and what is put around by people like Dmitriev, but also by Memorial, and I'm happy you mentioned Raginsky again, because it's a great loss that we've had. And other independent researchers, for example, Anatoly Razumov from the Center for Muon, and so on. And what the state wants to say about the Gulag, because what has happened is that for many years they've been kind of ignoring or not funding at all any of these NGOs. Then over the last few years, what has happened is that while they are attacking these independent scholars, so Memorial being labeled as a foreign agent, and other NGOs, and Dmitriev now on the trial, and so on, they are building a museum of the history of the Gulag, brand new, actually very well done, to be honest, in the center of Moscow. This new huge monument to the victims of repression in Moscow, and so on. So at the same moment, they are doing something for the Gulag, but they're kind of repressing the independent voices. It's a bit of a difficult frame, but to make it very simple, I think that the reason why he's been targeted is this, and actually behind the Dmitriev's arrest, there is the fact that at a certain point, in 2016, two historians put forward the idea that in Sandarmokh there were also prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war killed by the Finns in the 1943-1944, which is the persecution of the Winter War. And they're actually sort of trying to put forward the idea that that actually is a prisoner of war camp, where mass burial, where the victims are Soviet soldiers of the Red Army, and so on. However, this is clearly impossible, and John gave me a fantastic report done by Anna Yarovaya, who has researched the situation like really deep. And she's been talking to Finnish historians, she's been talking to different historians, and so on. And everybody says that it's absolutely impossible that there is prisoners of wars. The people that put forward this idea mention an archival document from FSB, by the way. However, the archival document doesn't say that these people have been buried in Sandarmokh. It says that there might have been some mass shootings, but what we know so far is that mass shootings never happened. There have been some shootings, but never in numbers of thousands. There have been dozens, sometimes 50 prisoners of war, and the Finns have done, alas, war crimes, but surely not in Sandarmokh. Also because Sandarmokh is 20 kilometers away from the front line, and all the mass shootings that have been during that war were done on the front line, and all the experts agree that there was no reason whatsoever why they would carry bodies for 20 kilometers away from the front line. So what's happening is that they're probably trying to reframe the history and the memory of Sandarmokh into something that is more aligned with the official, let's say, version of the events.
Can I add something very briefly to what Andrea has said? Just very briefly. You see, this memory war that Andrea was talking about, it was going on during the Soviet years, of course, and I think in the article of Yarovaya, a wonderful example is mentioned. Katyn was the place where the cream of Polish intelligentsia, Polish officers were killed. When I was at school, we were never taught about Katyn, but we were told about Khatyn, the place, the little village in Belarusia, where the Nazis destroyed people. The aim is to confuse, and I think you asked a question, I didn't see who but the question was asked, why should the authorities today do it about the country that doesn't exist? You see, the KGB exists. The FSB today has the power, it rules the country. So it does want to impose the narrative, and especially in the last couple of years. They are very intense in imposing the narrative that would suit them. So that's the answer. That's why Yury Dmitriev is in prison.
Can I just follow up? I didn't hear you so clearly. Are you talking about Finnish prisoners of war, or are you talking about Red Army soldiers that were repatriated?
Red Army, no. I'm talking about Red Army soldiers during the war. So basically the front arrived up to Medvedegorsk, which is the closest city to Sandarmokh. And so the theory that they're putting forward is that the Soviet prisoners of war, which is documented that they were used to build defense lines, trenches, and so on, and many of them were killed, some were shot, many died of hunger, and so on. So what they're trying to say is that the people in Sandarmokh, apart from the political prisoners, which they say that they are, they don't deny the fact that there is a mass burial of political prisoners, they say that apart from that, there are also Red Army Soviet soldiers who were killed by the Finns and buried there. Okay. That's the version.
Because within the Norilsk prisoner memoir, there are stories of Red Army officers that were taken by the Finns and then were shot, while the other ranks were then eventually transported from Solovki up to Norilsk, and that's just one story that the prisoners told. So I was getting confused with why.
No. It's a slightly separate version. Yeah.
The conclusion, which it's a 7,000-word article. It's taken a year to research. Anna Yarovaya, who's a young journalist based in Petrozavodsk, writes for an internet news website, 7x7, Horizontal Russia it's called. And she talked to everyone involved, and her conclusion was that what they wanted people to think as a result was, okay, Stalin was bad, but other people were also bad. And this was, as Razumovsky, as Dmitriev's close friend and colleague said, it's the Katyn principle all over again, that it was the Germans who did it, it was the Finns who did it. Andrea, being a historian, speaks respectfully of the historians, who of course are careful what they say, but each time these stories are retold they become cruder and less accurate. So the first version is there were also some, we have a hypothesis that there might also have been some Soviet prisoners of war. The next time it's told is there were thousands of our poor soldiers who were tortured to death by the Finns. And Memorial, in inverted commas, as though it's a dubious something or other, has completely overlooked this. In other words, deliberately overlooked this. And this is the way, from a historical article which was published in a Finnish newspaper, to the annoyance of certain Finnish historians who've researched this subject in depth, then was quoted by Izviestia, but considerably simplified in the version of Izviestia, and then it got onto Zvezda TV, which is the Ministry of Defense television channel, where it was said that there were these thousands of Soviet soldiers who were tortured, and that's who's really, we want to put up a monument to them in Sandamoh as well. So this is the kind of, yes.
Wait, so is Sandamoh in Russia or in Finland? Because I'm getting confused.
Yeah, sure.
It's in Russian.
It's in Russia. It's in Karelia, which is to the east of Finland.
And it was Finland.
It was Finland. It's a good.
Because the war, there was the Winter War between the Soviet forces, and then when the Germans invaded, the Finns invaded Karelia, and there was what is called a continuation war. And there were atrocities committed, and after the war, Finnish soldiers and officers were put on trial. Most were acquitted for lack of evidence. So there was investigation of war crimes, and it was seen that there are dozens, at most several hundred, who were shot out of hand in war crimes, Soviet soldiers who were captured, POWs, but nowhere is it suggested that there were thousands. And Sandamoh contains at least 7,000 bodies. No one knows how many. Yes, it's one of the biggest. Yes, it's a massive, including the flower of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, who were arrested in 1934, taken to Solovki, and then, as Andrea was saying, they were shipped off the island and nobody knew what had happened to them. There were suggestions that the barges had been sunk in the White Sea, and that's where they'd gone. But eventually, thanks to the people from Memorial, it was discovered where they were. And one thing which we should add is that Sandamoh, the day of remembrance there on the 5th of August, has always been international. And so there have been Ukrainian delegations, there have been Polish delegations, because at one time one of the categories of people to be rounded up and shot in their thousands during the Great Terror were Poles. Anyone who's a Pole. Pole by definition is an enemy. And there are 200 Poles who were shot for that reason, who lie in
I think there were 58 nationalities.
Yes, there are 58 nationalities, yes, and confessions, various confessions. Yes.
Hi, sorry to change direction a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about what role international pressure plays in this, and international entities, particularly when you have the Foreign Agent Law as a component of the overall picture. So for organizations like Memorial and Dmitriev's case, does international pressure actually, or any petitions, things like that, does that do anything? Does that actually, it almost seems like in a roundabout way, it could, harden certain officials' views of a person or organization in Russia?
That's an argument which has been repeated ever since the 1970s, and the dissidents said then, no, it cannot harm us. The more publicity there is about our situation, the better. Various governments, for their own reasons, decided not always to listen to their advice, and I think in this case it's very important to have people aware outside. I mean, I wouldn't devote all the time to the website and translating things into English if I didn't think it wasn't important for people to have, because there's very limited reporting about it in the mainstream press.
I guess in terms of the legal system, does that, so the actual court case, does that affect anything that the international eye is aimed at them, or does that not?
Oh, I think it's extremely important, that one should absolutely never underestimate the importance of things being reported outside of Russia, and things do get back in, and also of observing what goes on. And I think the fact that there are foreign observers at quite a few of the, I've done it myself and other people have done it, I think again, enormously important for the people who are on trial, also for the judges and prosecutors who are extremely well aware the fact they're being watched, and of course for the local human rights community. A big problem in Russia, though, is the fact that, you know, while there's a big kind of civil society and human rights community, it is very much cut off from the rest of society. So in Moscow in particular, you can live in a big bubble, you know, which is all your friends and you all more or less agree with each other, but where you have no contact at all actually with the mass of people outside. So I think this is, but information and the regime is extremely well aware of this, and particularly at the moment. Sorry, just 2 seconds. I mean, what's been happening recently is that young people are not watching television anymore. And so people under 24, and the regime finds this very scary indeed, you know. So, so the young people are getting their information from the internet, and that's why now, you know, very recently there are increasing attempts to clamp down on that, but it's actually quite hard to do, and the cat is out of the bag, in a way. And then you have, you know, whatever reservations I have about Navalny, he does a wonderful job. I mean, with these films that go viral all over Russia and everyone watches them, it is quite extraordinary, I think. And you know, so this is one of the great developments, I think, of the past year or so in Russia. But so therefore, it is.
Very quick question: when Dmitriev dug up all these bodies, how did he know who they all belonged to? Did they have some kind of identification?
No, because they weren't soldiers. But what he did, and he's obviously annoyed the FSB locally on many occasions. He made a big protest when they wanted to put up a statue of Andropov. Unfortunately, they did, because he was there during the Great Patriotic War, watching everyone as a young NKVD man. And one of the things he did, he said, "This information is no good. You're just giving me a number of people. I want the names. I want the reports of we have shot this list of people. I want all these details." And he just went to the FSB and he said, "You must give them to me." And he was then working with a man called Ivan Chukhin, who was a deputy of first of all of the Russians, the Supreme Soviet, and then I think of the Duma, who supported him and said, "Yes, you know, we must get them." So in other parts of the country, you know, you knew that I've got there's a list on the Bukovsky website which shows, you know, 2,000, they want additional shootings, they want additional arrests. How many can they have? 1,500 in Armenia, 2,000 in Georgia, 3,000 in Krasnoyarsk region. You know, but those are just numbers. Those are just numbers. Getting at the actual names, who's on the list, and who was shot, and identifying who is in a particular pit. Well, Dmitriev started to train as a doctor. And he has a wonderful, he quotes Ursula Le Guin, a wonderful quotation. I should have written it down. It's as a person goes through life, their choices become narrow and narrow until they're doing the thing they're meant to do, and they have no choice. And that, he says, he feels his position, because he did training as a medical. He also did a certain amount of archaeology somewhere along the line. And taking those together, he can look at a pit and see how many people there are and say how many men and women. You know, so there was one pit which had 27 men and 1 woman, 28. There's a list of 28 people who were to be shot. So you've got the names. I mean, in Krasny Bor, which is this killing field next to Petrozavodsk, he managed to name almost everyone who was there. I mean, that's 1,000 people by working through these lists. First of all, insisting that the lists were given to him, which he did in his blunt way, and then just working through. I mean, Sandomorsk is a bigger job. Sandomorsk, they've got roughly half the names, I think.
The Sandomorsk, there's also.
Sorry, go ahead.
There's also the fact that basically there were a series of archival documents that came out from different places. So for example, at a certain point it came out the so-called Расстрельные списки from the Selevki, which is a list of all the names of all the people that they had to kill, 1,111. And they started to trace down the movements, and they were trying to understand under which jurisdiction they were. So they worked together with Anatoly Razumov, Irina Flige, and Veniamin Yofi and other people. The thing that I think, if I don't remember wrongly, made them arrive to Sandarmokh was that at a certain point they found a document about Matviev, who was the person who was in charge of the execution, so the person who was killing everybody. And at a certain point, if I don't remember wrongly, he writes a report where he said that his truck full of prisoners to be killed broke down. And it broke down in a place that was very close to Sandarmokh. So they started digging around there until they found it. And what they did was to see the vegetation and to see different things. So this is told by Razumov, by the way, and also by Irina Flige, about how they did it on the Selevki. So they went to the places where they thought that they might have been. They started analyzing different levels in the ground, different vegetation, and so on. They started digging until they found it. It's absolutely extraordinary what they've done.
Yes, and these sites are distinctive because the trees are all the same age. You know, people have known not to go there. In fact, some of them have been actually fenced off for 60 years, and so the trees are all the same age. But you can still see something in the lie of the ground. I mean, he became an expert at it, of course, Dmitriev. Rod.
Just a little footnote to this thing of the sort of importance of naming. It's extraordinary how sort of precisely this is a kind of reverse echo of two lines from the last epilogue of Anna Akhmatova's Requiem. Хотелось бы всех поименно назвать, да отняли список и негде узнать. One would like to name them all, but they've taken the list away and there's nowhere to find out. But actually, Akhmatova proves.
Yes.
He's proving her wrong. Remarkable how well he answers her.
I also wanted to join in about the theme of the names, because I was wondering about the Ukrainians killed there, because these were not just Ukrainians, as all the Poles were just killed there. Because in Ukraine, I'm just looking at Olga because I'm sure she might be able to tell us a little bit more about who exactly were the people. Maybe you can just give some names.
It's like dramatists like Mykola Kulish who was killed there. There was family of Khrushchevnitsky who came from Western Ukraine. They believed in Soviet. So they were intelligentsia of Ukraine. They were well-known people who were killed there. So and now it's at least when people study their biographies, they can say that they were killed there.
Were they all arrested at once? I mean, these Ukrainian intellectuals and cultural figures.
They were all in.
They were different raids. They were arrested in different moments. Usually, they would take circles and arrest them all together. Almost all of them ended up in the Selevki prison camp. There was like Plyushnik, who was a pretty famous writer, Les Kurbas, who was a very famous playwright, and then he actually worked at the Selevki prison camp theater until they decided to shoot him. And there were a huge amount of intelligenti from the Ukraine, and then they were all put in the list and all killed, all of them.